welcome everybody. I'm really glad you're here, and I'm honored to be presenting to you the first symposium of the Center on Mindfulness and Integrative Health Intervention Development, also known as C-MIIND. And it's a really exciting time. This is the very beginning of our center. We're poised to do amazing things, and so I'm just grateful for your interest and engagement in this topic. So we have some amazing world-class speakers, but I want to begin, before getting to the formal scientific talks, with just a very brief overview of what the center is about. So the vision for the Center on Mindfulness and Integrative Health Intervention Development is, simply put, to be the leading hub of research on mindfulness and integrative health interventions in the Intermountain West and in the United States. The mission of the center is to develop, test, optimize, and disseminate mindfulness and other integrative health interventions founded on a firm foundation of discoveries from basic biobehavioral science. That's really an important aspect of what we're going to do. So what are integrative health interventions? Integrative health interventions are those that address the needs of the whole person by enhancing cognitive, emotional, biobehavioral, and social factors implicated in well-being and in human flourishing, both within the individual as well as across communities. And this integrative approach is really supported by decades of good, solid research, both basic research, translational research, and clinical research, showing linkages between the mind, the brain, and the body. So the work that we're going to do here it has a good, firm foundation in science. So why are we doing this work? The need for the center is quite simply that our society is faced with a lot of complex problems right now. And in particular, we're facing complex health problems in which comorbidity is the norm rather than the exception. And most of the therapies that we have for problems like chronic pain, addiction, obesity, depression, and so forth, really are not designed to address the complex comorbidities that draw these conditions together. In fact, a lot of these conditions co-occur together quite regularly. So we need, if the conditions are complex and interconnected and interdependent, then we need complex, interdependent interventions that can address them. The goals of the center. Simply put, the goal of the center is to maintain a funded program of research on mindfulness and integrative behavioral health interventions that's focused on unpacking both the mechanisms of action, so how do these treatments work, as well as the outcomes of the treatments. Do they work? And also, a secondary question is, but very important, is for whom do these therapies work? And we're going to be doing this to advance science, but we're also going to be doing this to support clinical services at the University of Utah. A secondary goal of this center is to promote an integrative health workforce that supports the needs of both the state, the nation, and the university as a whole. And lastly, this is an academic institution. We're devoted to teaching students. So one of the aims of the center is to teach students and fellows in how to conduct very rigorous research on mindfulness and integrative health interventions so that we can have a firm foundation of evidence to support their efficacy and mechanisms. And here's a schematic of the C-MIIND research process. So C-MIIND researchers are going to be targeting the scientific process at each of these 4 steps. We're going to do all of this because each one of these pieces is necessary in order to develop new therapies to tackle these complex problems. So again, I'm Eric Garland. I'm the director of the center, but I'm joined by a very esteemed cadre of scholars from a wide array of disciplines, and the C-MIIND research affiliates are listed here. So across this team, we have interdisciplinary expertise that spans social work, internal medicine, psychiatry, anesthesiology, psychology, oncology, physical therapy, nursing, and neuroscience. And we'll also be reaching out to partners in education and philosophy as well. C-MIIND affiliates have a broad array of research expertise in a variety of areas that are really important to, again, unpacking the mechanisms of integrative health interventions and assessing their outcomes. So we're really quite well poised to do some impactful work. In terms of our currently funded projects, the center is overseeing more than $17 million in federally funded research projects. These projects are staffed by teams of investigators, many of whom are C-MIIND research affiliates. And the majority of these projects are focused on the study of mindfulness as a treatment for chronic pain and prescription opioid-related issues. But again, we will be expanding our focus in the future to tackle other problems, as I indicated before, like obesity or other forms of addiction. So I just want to offer a thank you first to Senior Vice President Ruth Watkins and Vice President for Research Andy Wyrick, who really encouraged me, as well as Dean Emeritus Hank Lisi. They pushed me to put this center together, even when I thought I started to falter and think it wasn't going to work out. They encouraged me. They thought it was that important. And I want to offer my deep thanks to Dean Martell Teasley, our new dean in the College of Social Work, who's in the back of the room here, as well as my colleagues at the College of Social Work for your continued commitment to support this endeavor. And I want to thank all of you for your interest being here and your engagement in this process. So thank you so much. It's my true honor to introduce Dr. Susan Bauer-Wu, President of the Mind and Life Institute, the world's premier multidisciplinary organization for the scientific study of mindfulness and meditation, founded in 1991 by the Dalai Lama and neuroscientist Francisco Varela. I'm personally forever grateful to the Mind and Life Institute because the Mind and Life Institute gave my first research grant back when I was a PhD student. It was to the sum total of $15,000. And that $15,000 grant to study mindfulness has grown into over $20 million in research funding. So not only has the money grown in terms of a great return on investment in supporting science, but these projects that I personally have done that have grown out of the Varela grant have alleviated the suffering of literally more than 1,000 people. So I thank you for them too. Susan Bauer-Wu has also dedicated her career to alleviating suffering. With a foundation as a registered nurse caring for individuals with cancer and mental illness, as well as those facing the end of life, she's had a stellar academic career studying and applying contemplative practices in healthcare and in higher education. Prior to joining the Mind and Life Institute, Dr. Bauer-Wu was a named professor in contemplative end-of-life care at the University of Virginia School of Nursing and associate faculty in the University of Virginia Department of Religious Studies, as well as on the executive committee of the University of Virginia Contemplative Sciences Center. Dr. Bauer-Wu has garnered significant federal, foundation, and private funding for research on meditation-based and contemplative interventions and programs for people living with serious illness and their loved ones, as well as for the healthcare professionals who care for these individuals. Her training background is in psychoneuroimmunology, and followed by postdoctoral training in psycho-oncology and behavioral medicine at Dartmouth Medical School. Her first full-time faculty appointment was at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, where she collaborated with the University of Massachusetts Center for Mindfulness, which, if you're not familiar, that's really the group that got this whole business started with integrating mindfulness into healthcare. This was when the integration of her personal meditation practice and professional work as a researcher and teacher of mindfulness-based interventions took root. She then went on to Harvard Medical School and the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, where she led a robust research center focused on enhancing cancer patients' quality of life and quality of clinical care. Later, Dr. Bauer-Wu was at Emory University as an associate professor of nursing and as a Georgia Cancer Coalition Distinguished Scholar. She co-created the Emory Collaborative for Contemplative Studies and contributed to the teaching of Tibetan Buddhist monks in science. Dr. Bauer-Wu is a fellow in the American Academy of Nursing, past president of the Society for Integrative Oncology, a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Executive Nurse Fellow, and in my opinion, an all-around delightful, brilliant, and caring human being. I count her among my most esteemed mentors, and I'm deeply honored that she would come here to give the keynote at the launch of this center. Thank you, Susan. Please join me in welcoming her.
This is the real mic.
That's the real mic. This is the
Okay.
recording mic.
Okay,
Put that
so
on first.
just give me a moment. I didn't think about what I was putting on today. I have no collars to put this on, so let me just think about this for a second. Put this down. Put this one on. So this is for the recording. And I'll put it on my skirt in the back. Sorry, guys. Right. That's okay. And this I think I'll just hold in my hand.
Okay.
So thank you, Eric, for that. It's right there. Yeah, for a very, very kind introduction. And it's wonderful to see you all here. I wasn't sure in the middle of the summer if anybody would show up. And it speaks to how excited people are to the launch of this center. And congratulations on all the success that you've had and the ability to really pull together this interdisciplinary, cross-institutional, cross-university program. Before I begin, I think we're good. And is that a? I can.
Yep, it's working.
Okay, great. Can you all hear me in the back okay? Dean, yes, you can hear me good. Okay. So as we begin this time together, I just invite you to just be present. I'm not going to be doing a guided meditation, but I want you to be fully present as best you can and just noticing what's alive in you right now. And just realizing that you're here in community. And taking a moment to even reflect on your intention for being here. Was there anything more than the free lunch that brought you here? So this image is one that speaks to me very much. The idea of just one drop and there being many, many ripples and concentric circles that happen as a result of the one drop. And each one of you is a drop that creates a ripple effect and on the lives of so many other people. So whether or not you're a clinician or a teacher or a researcher or administrator, every one of you is touching lives all the time. And don't ever forget the power of that and the power of your presence with others. That makes the difference. Before I begin, I want to get a sense. There are seats over here if you want to come on up and. Okay. How many of you have practiced mindfulness in some way before, some form? Okay, look at this. So I'd say it's easily 3 out of 4 people. And so you already drank the Kool-Aid, which is great. But we also know that it's not just one thing and one kind of program, but there's many, and there's all, and so it's going to be taking a lot of creativity in that program. But that's good to know. How many of you would consider yourself a clinician of some kind? Nurse, social worker, doctor, okay? Basic scientist? You? Okay. Clinical scientist? Anybody from the humanities here? No one, okay. Well,
I got my undergrad.
well, more that probably some of others have gotten, right. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's really important to have people from the humanities involved in these conversations. Okay, great. So the title of my talk is Contemplative Sciences, Integrating Mindfulness into Research, Healthcare, and Society. And it's contemplative sciences because it's very much the incorporation of all of the different kinds of sciences, from basic sciences to social sciences, clinical sciences, and applied science, the other applied sciences. So my objectives, I'm going to provide a brief history of contemplative sciences, because there's actually a term now, and then there's sub-terms of contemplative sciences called contemplative neuroscience, contemplative clinical sciences, et cetera. And a brief history of the Mind and Life Institute, which is the organization where I come from, where this work was really, really born. Provide a definition, working definition of mindfulness, and describe some background of different mindfulness interventions, and just to highlight a little bit of the research, a little bit of the trends in the research as I highlight some of the studies that we're even funding at Mind and Life, and to end with shedding light on the importance of why a center like this and why these kind of interventions are needed, really so needed at this time, in not only in healthcare, but in our broader society. And I understand that we will have opportunities. We're going to have a panel. We'll have an opportunity for question and answers and discussion. So this is a photo of His Holiness the Dalai Lama with Francisco Varela, the late Francisco Varela. Both of them are co-founders of the Mind and Life Institute. And there was a third co-founder, Adam Engel, who's a businessman entrepreneur who was more on the organizational side of things to get the organization started. But why would somebody like Francisco Varela, who was a brilliant neuroscientist, and also a biologist, and a philosopher, and a contemplative practitioner, and he's kind of a Renaissance man, getting him together with the Dalai Lama, particularly when they did it, their first meeting was in 1987, seemed really unlikely. But that meeting and that coming together, I believe, planted the seed, was the drop in the water, really, that is bringing us all together today. And you may think, well, why? Why would someone who's such a serious scientist come together with a Buddhist teacher, a Buddhist leader and a Buddhist teacher? And they both had their reasons why. So the Dalai Lama loves science. He said if he wasn't a monk, he'd be an engineer, which I think you need to include the College of Engineering on your, I really think that would be really, really helpful, good idea. But he said if he wasn't a monk, he'd be an engineer. And if any of you have studied Buddhism and all read about it, you know that it is the principles are very scientific. It's about understanding the mind and asking questions and trying to look as objectively as you can to see things just as they are. In the veil of all of our illusions and all of the narratives and stories, what is the underlying truth? And so that was the Dalai Lama coming in from the Buddhist science perspective. And then we had a traditional scientist who's coming in who also had his own contemplative practice and his own meditation practice. And at the heart of this work is about understanding the mind. And I want to really, really emphasize that, because I think that with mindfulness becoming so faddish, there's a serious concern that we can, number one, lose sight that it's connected to some very, very important ancient wisdom traditions. And that's why I want people from the humanities here, philosophers, but also the religious studies scholars as well. It's really important that we don't lose sight of that history and those perspectives. But it is about, mindfulness is about understanding one's mind. So we can most skillfully make sense of what is happening, and then most skillfully engage with the world. So it is about understanding the mind. And that's at the heart of meditation. And it's not a quick feel better fast kind of thing, even though you can feel better very quickly from a brief contemplative practice. But we're looking at having impact on comorbidities. And that is really looking at whole person in a very, very deep and serious way. So they came together, and they had that initial conversation, the initial coming together. And this was one of the first meetings, Mind and Life meetings, over 30 years ago. And this is in the Dalai Lama's residence, where we've had many Mind and Life dialogues over the years. And we brought this technology. So any of you ever know Cliff Sarin? He's at the University of California in Davis. And Cliff is a neuroscientist, and he's really, really techie. And he went to India with all these machines, and others have done it over the years, the EEG. And I'll tell you a funny story. The first time that they did this, that they brought the EEG machines there, and they had a room full of monks like this, and the scientists up front, the Dalai Lama there, and they're watching. And they put the electrodes, the EEG electrodes, on the heads of the monk, of a monk. And they were like, why are you doing that? They said, we thought you wanted to study the mind. The mind isn't here. The mind is here. Which is just really, really interesting. It's just it's a paradigm shift, and we have to keep that in mind as we're working across different cultures. And it's another really important message for you to think about, that mindfulness isn't just about, and I'm going to talk more about it, but it's not just about paying attention, but it's the spirit of heartfulness that comes in this work, about this whole person, full sense of heartedness that it's about. So just a little bit more about the Mind and Life Institute. It's an organization it's a nonprofit organization, and we're doing work globally. And we are a hub, and we don't have any specific affiliation with one university, but we are bringing people together from all different disciplines and all different institutions. And under my leadership over the last year and a half, a big part of my focus is about taking down silos and being much more inclusive. I'm going to pause for one moment, and I see a lot of people standing in the back, and there's 6 seats right here, so come on up. Okay. Yeah, you're welcome. Great. Okay. Dean, there's one more here. Oh, okay. Okay. So we are the primary catalyst, convener, and community builder for contemplative sciences. And as we're rolling out our new work and priorities, we're looking at being a more formal resource for all of you that are doing the work. And that includes people in the applied side as a way of integrating and synthesizing and curating the research that's being done. And essentially, we integrate science with contemplative wisdom traditions and practices with the ultimate goal of alleviating suffering and promoting flourishing, with the basis of understanding the mind. So we give grants out. Keep that in mind. Our grants range between $15,000 and $100,000. And Eric was a recipient of one of our first grants. Yoshi, did you ever receive a Mind and Life grant?
Yeah.
Yes. So, and the return on investment of our grants is really quite incredible. So we have the Francisco Varela research grants, which are for new investigators. We have Mind and Life 1440 grants that are for K through 12 education. And then we have a new program called the Peace Grants, which stands for Pro-Social Empathy, Altruism, Compassion, and Ethics. And in that category, we have $25,000 and $100,000 grants. And then we have think tanks. And the think tanks are about bringing very diverse kinds of people together to explore and tackle an important either academic and research issue or an issue in society. And those are really taking off as well. And so we have a variety of mechanisms that foster our sense of community of both scholars and practitioners. We have a Summer Research Institute every year in New York in June. Every other year we have an International Symposium for Contemplative Research. It's going to be in November in 2018 in Phoenix. And we have a fellows program. We're just launching a new preprint service for contemplative sciences. So if we all know the problems with open access and the issues of academic publishing, and so we are looking at, we are hosting a preprint service in collaboration with the Center for Open Science that's called Mind Archive. And we're creating a contemplative research commons, which will be digital. So just some examples of some of our recently funded studies. So this one is from Sarah Pretty. Sarah here? Yes? There you go. OK. So this is Sarah's study, The Impact of Mindfulness-Based Intervention and Opioid Misuse During Pregnancy. Mixed methods. This is on tracking the longitudinal real-world socio-emotional benefits of mindfulness training in youth. Investigating the impact of yoga on brain aging, epigenetic biomarkers of school-based mindfulness program, and a community engagement approach to contemplative neuroscience in a diverse contemplative community. These are just literally a handful of the hundreds of studies that we're funding, and I want to just emphasize that what makes Strong Mind and Life grants really is interdisciplinary, really integrating mixed methods, all different kinds of methods. We value community-based research as well as qualitative research, as well as very basic biological and neuroscience research as well. So that was just a brief overview of our history and background, and now just take a pause and seeing where you are at this particular time. So just to remember, so to cultivate a way of being that is more mindful, it's often done with formal contemplative practices, formal meditation practices. Meditation and medicine have the same root. Latin word, meditare, to comfort, to heal, to care for. Again, keeping that in mind. So the components of mindfulness, and this is based on the traditional work that Jon Kabat-Zinn started in the 70s, conceptualizing mindfulness as a way of bringing awareness to the present moment, and doing so with an attitude that is non-judgmental. It's hard, that's hard, but it's best we try to be non-judgmental and just sort of see things as they are. And we are intentionally doing that. So we are paying attention on purpose in a particular way. Few points here of what mindfulness is not. And I think we know from doing concept analyses that some of the best ways to really understand a concept is to describe what it's not. And then we all of a sudden get the answer for what it is. So I'm going to share some thoughts I have of what mindfulness is not. It's not trying to achieve a special state of mind. So you don't go, you're not approaching it saying, I'm going to relax. Because the moment that you strive to say you're going to relax, you're actually, in many ways, interfering with the space, the mental space of being more mindful, which then can help you to be more relaxed. You naturally noticed whatever mind states you're experiencing, and you're aware of them, and you don't force them to change. They're going to change anyway. It's not about going into a trance. Rather, it's about being alert and attentive to what is happening. It's not thinking only positive thoughts, though your recovery program might be. But mindfulness more broadly is about noticing the whole continuum of thoughts that we have, positive, negative, neutral. So all of them, because that's what being human is. And if we're not just going to be, we can't just think about positive thoughts because we'll be judging that we're not able to do that all the time. But all thoughts are regarded equally in this general practice. It's not necessarily about doing anything in its purest, simplest sense. It's about being. It's a way of being. And yes, you can do things mindfully, and you can do mindfulness practices, formal meditation practices. But if we're talking about being mindful, it's much more about a state of being. And then it's not about distracting yourself and imagining that you're somewhere else, somewhere where you don't want to be. So we know there are other mind-body practices such as guided imagery that are really, quite effective for a number of different clinical conditions. This is not that. In many ways, it's the antithesis of that. And for many years, I did research and clinical work with patients in the bone marrow transplant unit. And what we did is really helping them to be okay in the hospital for weeks and uncomfortable and not where they want to be. But how can they actually learn to be more accepting to the experience that they are facing? And to me, mindfulness gives more life skills that will help them deal with the challenge, help us deal with the challenges of life versus guided imagery, where it's kind of an escape, maybe in some ways like way people refer to drugs and other substances as an escape. So another definition that I've made sense of in my practice and in teaching is our ability to intentionally bring awareness to the present moment experience with an attitude of openness, curiosity, and being awake to the fullness of our lives, using all five senses, and then also noticing the continuum of our minds. And in that noticing, we're not holding on to the things that we just like or pushing away things we don't like, but we're noticing all of it. It's all okay. And we're stopping autopilot. And we're also learning to respond skillfully instead of reacting like a knee-jerk reaction. It's more wise action. So this is in essence, what mindfulness is. Many people say, I can't be mindful. It's not, I'm too jittery. I got to go, 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 go. But I want to say is you can go, 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 but in a way that's with some kind of awareness. And it's innately in all of us. We've just kind of moved away from it over time. So it's kind of pop right now, and there is science that's being done. And we know that meditation can change the brain. And why do we know that? How do we know that? Well, neuroplasticity, last 20 years, we have come to the great realization that, in fact, we can grow and expand different parts of our brain if we use them, other parts of our brain, if we don't use, they aren't quite as sharp. And we can re-engage the neurocircuitry and reconnect different parts of the brain that we didn't think was possible just 30 years ago. And so in this way, I believe all the kind of interventions and the programs that you're going to be doing and you are doing are types of mental trainings. They're mental trainings that impact the body and they impact your behavior. So it's about this neuroplasticity idea is in many ways like physical exercise, but they're mental exercises. So brief history, we mentioned it a bit, but I think it's just really important to just take a moment and to name that, yes, Mind and Life and the research that undergirds this work is a big part of the boom right now. But these mindfulness-based practices really took root as a result of Jon Kabat-Zinn's work at the University of Massachusetts. Began the program in 1979. And seeing where we are today, I mean, Jon would never have ever imagined this in his wildest dreams. And he did not begin this work to become famous and to have a real popular program, but he did it. He was driven by this desire to alleviate suffering, informed by his own personal meditation practice. And Jon, by the way, for those of you who don't know him, he's an MIT-trained molecular scientist, and was trained by a Nobel laureate. And so he comes with a real deep scientific understanding, as well as a very open, compassionate heart. So the Mbsr program is an 8-week outpatient program. You have great Mbsr programs here in this town. I know one of the teachers very well, Vicki Overfelt. She and I actually did our teacher development intensive through the UMass Center for Mindfulness together. She's a great resource, as well as others at the university and in the community. And so there's lots of mindfulness-based interventions. And there's also a lot of studies to support these interventions. And so this chart, just take a moment and look at the steep curve. And once you start getting some of your papers out with the new grants that are happening, it's just skyrocketing. It's crazy how this is going. But last year, these are peer-reviewed scientific papers on mindfulness. So this year, it's estimating it's going to be probably close to 800-900 papers this year. So examples of studies, and this is just a smattering, and these are NIH-funded studies on mindfulness. So different kinds of cancer, military veterans, the elderly, eating, weight loss and eating disorders, drug addiction, smoking cessation, heart disease, pain, skin disorders, insomnia, at-risk behaviors, asthma, etc. It's going down. At the end, it has resilience among police officers. So we're now looking at really bringing this work out into the communities as well, but in research format. So a lot of studies are being done, have been done over the last 20 years, 15 to 20 years in particular, that look at how these mental practices, in fact, change the brain function. And these findings were the first findings that we found with meditation training. The first work with meditation training, with mindfulness meditation training, it's actually started out through our Mind and Life work and doing research on sort of the Olympic athletes of meditation. And these are basically meditation practitioners, monks, other meditation adepts who practice 10, 20, 30,000 hours. And so we learned a lot about them. And from that's where the program started becoming adapted, and the mindfulness-based interventions have been unfolding. But we know that these are the core areas of this type of attention awareness training. So better able to focus attention. And as we look at these, just think about your own work, your own lives, your work with your students, your children, your parents. So focusing attention. We are in a distracted age like never before. And we know that these practices help us to focus better and handle distractions better, less ruminations, better ability to adapt to unexpected changes. Things don't always go our way, do they? Monitoring and perceiving the environment. I could say, as a former clinical nurse, monitoring and perceiving the environment is a really important thing because there's many things happening at the same time. Perceiving our internal body sensations. Foundational to most of these mindfulness-based interventions is this idea of body scans or interoceptivity, which is tuning into your own bodily viscera. And if we are too much living in our heads, we're not even in tune with the cues that our body is giving us all the time. And we also know that in empathy research, that the ability to tune into one's internal bodily experience and sense your body sensations yourself is foundational to experiencing true empathy. Because you can't put yourself in the shoes of another if you can't even put yourself in your own shoes. And then less activation of fear regions. These are just some examples, but these are some of the classic work and time again. And these are examples of some of the many mindfulness-based interventions that are around right now. There's lots of them. The MBSR, and then there's Nbct, which I'm going to talk more about. There's eating therapy and child preventing, relapse prevention, elder care, cancer recovery, art. Mental fitness training is specific to the military. And then we have more, which is mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement. So just want to highlight an example of this translation, this trajectory that I think has been beautifully done and might be a really good model for some of the work you're doing. So mindfulness-based cognitive therapy is an 8-week program. And it's an adaptation of the Mbsr program. It's sort of this marriage of Mbsr, mindfulness-based stress reduction, with cognitive behavioral training, CBT. And it's particularly developed for people with a history of depression. And it's been extensively studied in preventing relapse from depression. So just to walk you through some of the highlights of what some of the key study findings. This was one of the first studies they did, 2000, John Teasdale at Oxford in England. And this was comparing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy with treatment as usual. And this was really phenomenal, looking at 60 weeks later, the difference and how basically the relapse of depression was less than half those that were in the Nbct group. That study has been repeated a few times. Now this is a really exciting study, I think, because it looks head-on at Nbct and antidepressant therapy to prevent depression relapse. And this was published in Lancet in 2015. And look at that. What do you see here? They look about the same. And so basically this is showing that there is essentially no difference between an 8-week biobehavioral program and very expensive drug therapy that people will have to take every day for years.
Can I ask a question? Does that include that people are practicing on a regular basis after that 8-week program, or just they're doing that 8-week program and nothing else?
It's an 8-week program, and then what happens, and we're going to talk about, we can talk about it in the panel. We'll come back to it, okay? Yep. And I'll just, if you're interested in this particular topic in Nbct, Zindel Siegel, who's at the University of Toronto, he did a keynote at our International Symposium Contemplative Studies last November. That was a great overview of the field, really, really well done. And you could, you could see it on YouTube. All of our master lectures and keynotes are available. You could take a look at it. But Zindel's keynote was phenomenal. And he's a serious clinical scientist. So in the UK, it's actually now a core component of the national health system there. And this is funded for the treatment of preventing relapse of depression. And then the UK has taken this work so seriously that they're going beyond Nbct for depression, but they actually have a whole plan that's been approved by the Parliament called Mindful Nation UK, and that was approved in October 2015. So my very last part here is just to recognize and for us to think about the societal implications of what this all means. There's so much suffering. Medical center, the elementary schools, in the various homes, nursing homes. It's pretty incredible. And I love this quote by Margaret Cullen, who's a really wonderful mindfulness teacher in the Bay Area. She says, it, being mindfulness, is an antidote to the disease of the 21st century life and its attendant ever-increasing pull toward multitasking and 24/7 connectivity. The costs to our mental and physical well-being are many and may include depression, anxiety, and a variety of stress-related health concerns. So our bodies and our minds can only handle so much. And with the mindfulness practice, I like to think of it as like being in like a muddy pond. That the muddy pond is the fullness of our lives, and our brains are just going all the time. And if you just kind of let it settle and let the waters calm, the mud will settle. And it just settles, and you could see more clearly and live more wisely by just giving yourself these little micro moments of mental space. And again, if you're having trouble kind of getting this, just hang out with kids under age 7, say, and also puppies, and maybe the two of them together with an ice cream cone. And this is kokoros. Remember I talked about the EEG and electrodes, and this is a Japanese symbol for both mind and heart. No distinction, not a separate word. It's one word. So again, cultivating a spirit of not just paying attention, but cultivating the sense of heartfulness. And this was just some work that I've done. I have done a lot of work with end-of-life care, and this was this idea of building a sense of compassionate and contemplative silence between patients and clinicians. Healthcare, care of the caregivers is really important. It was a major focus of my work before I left the University of Virginia. And we absolutely, it's essential that it's part of clinician education. And then it's not only for clinicians to bring to their patients, but it's for their own self-care, their own survival. And this was a study, this was a classic study led by colleagues at the University of Rochester, published in JAMA. It was a 1-year mindfulness program. It was an 8-week program, then once a month for a year with primary care physicians, and found benefits in terms of professional satisfaction in their clinical care. And this was a study that looked at mindful clinicians, and it was an observational study, and it was not interventional, but I find it really, really interesting. And so the bottom line, which we would know, we wouldn't be surprised, think about your own self or your own family member going to see a clinician. Somebody who actually seems like they're present and not running out the door looking at a computer screen. You probably think it's more patient-centered, right? Because it is. And there's a more positive emotional tone. And you leave just feeling better because you've been around that. But many clinicians that I work with say that they don't have any more time to be mindful. They just don't have it. Well, the reality is that the study looked at the length, and there was no difference in the amount of the clinical encounter. But it's just the quality of the encounter that's different. And I did a bunch of studies. I had a decade program of research as it relates to mindfulness-based intervention with stem cell autologous transplant patients to enhance resiliency. Don't have time to get into the results of that here, but suffice to say we had improvements in pain on over 1,300 clinical encounters, more happy, sense of well-being. And then I'm going to just end with this quote here as it relates to this study. And this is the actual gentleman who said this quote. And this is a man who was a self-described type A personality, very successful businessman in every way that we would define success. And he went into the program with great reluctance and signed on to the study because his wife wanted him to. And this is what he said 3 months later. And he said, "It, being mindfulness meditation, has changed the whole quality of my life and has become a daily ritual. It's one of the most important parts of my recovery. It lowered my anxiety, increased my sense of control, relaxes and refreshes me. The more I meditated, the more calm I became. And before, I was always someone who fretted about things. And now, I'm focused on the pleasure of the moment. And the days are not agonizing, even if I'm feeling really ill." He said this actually at a time when he learned that his transplant had failed and there were no other treatment options, and he was home on hospice. And then a few months later, I did not work with him. I was not involved directly, but I was a PI on a study, and I got a card in the mail, and it was from his wife. And she thanked me. And she said that participating in this mindfulness-based intervention made all the difference in the quality of their relationship and the last days that they had together. So I'm going to just end with some closing comments, and these are recommendations for C-MIIND, for Eric, and for all of you collaborators. This is just sort of my little words of wisdom. So, do solid science. Do solid science, but please keep it grounded in real-world matters. Just not do science for science sake, but really connecting it with real suffering. And please collaborate. Please collaborate. Please take down silos and have your work be transdisciplinary with the scientists, with the humanists, clinicians, contemplative practitioners, and those in positions of influence and policy. Just like what they did with the UK, wouldn't it be great if some of these programs actually became part of our healthcare system of what's paid for? And please, and I think in your work of developing a center, this is also a perfect time for you to identify core values that you want to live by, not only as the team of people and cultivating your own sense of community, but even the work that you do. And so for Mind and Life, these are the values that my team and our broader team have that are guiding our work, which is rigor, kind-heartedness, integrity, synergy, and community. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me okay? Is it okay? I do have an accent. It's not from Kentucky, so I'll try to speak slowly, and if I go too fast, please slow me down. So the placebo thematic actually followed the idea that social interactions in the clinical context actually do seem to do something. And I will tell you a little bit about the neurobiology behind this. There are no financial disclosures in the talk. So this started with the field of pain now about 30, 40 years ago. And it was observed that in post-surgical patients or in experimental pain models, such as the ischemic pain, which was used in this context a lot, when there was expectation of analgesia, during an administration of a placebo in a clinical trial. This was associated with reductions in pain ratings. You will say, well, no big deal, right? I mean, pain, like mood or affective states, are subjective experiences, so this could be biases, simply, no big deal. But the interesting part about that is that this effect was actually antagonized by naloxone, which is an opioid receptor antagonist. Whether using open or hidden injections, various models. And back in 2004, in the first imaging study using fMRI and a brief pain, basic pain model, I was shown also that a topical cream applied, which was a placebo, this was associated with reductions in the functional areas involved in the perception and representation of pain, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex, but also thalamus and insular cortex, while the anticipation of placebo was engaging cognitive areas of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In particular, the rostral anterior cingulate activation and the relationship with placebo responses in the context of pain now has been replicated across a number of studies. So this has been already well done. So if you think about what the opioid systems do, if you think neurobiology of pain, you oftentimes think about areas such as the periaqueductal gray or the rostroventral medulla, which use the endogenous opioids and mu-opioid receptors to regulate pain signal coming from the periphery. And there are descending inhibition of the signal. Some of this is mediated through the endogenous opioid system. However, if you look at the distribution of mu-opioid receptors, which mediate the effects of the opiates, they are all throughout the brain. Thalamus, basal ganglia, ventral dorsal, cognitive areas, emotional regulatory areas, etc. So it's a fairly complex system. So we began looking at this with the model of pain, just to see how placebo administration actually changes things. And the one that we used, the idea was to utilize a model of pain that was safe, of course, that would maintain pain over a period of time. So we did these studies over 20 minutes. And the idea was to utilize a pain model that was relevant for clinical pain conditions. Brief pain, basic pain, I would argue is actually irrelevant for pain conditions because it's a warning signal. Once pain is more sustained, even if moderate, it becomes an stressor, something that actually challenges the homeostasis of the organism. So the one that we used was using hypertonic saline, which is the pain model, which activates nerve endings, maintain that for 20 minutes, using the controller, so the pain was actually standardized between individuals. And also we had a saline control condition, which controlled for, having needles put in your masseter muscle and all these things going on around you and rating the pain, which is normal saline, which doesn't cause pain. That was the model. And then we used positron emission tomography. For those who are not familiar with this technique, is the use of radio tracers that label a particular receptor site. So the ones that we use for these studies involve carbon-11 carfentanil, which is a mu-opioid receptor radio tracer, and carbon-11 raclopride, which is a dopamine receptor tracer. And when we make these measurements at baseline, you will have the tracer in red occupying receptors, and there will be some endogenous ligand kind of floating around, and you get a signal which has to do with how much of the tracer is actually coupled with the receptors. If you were to activate the system, so you release a lot of these endogenous ligands, dopamine or endogenous opioids, for example, you will have less of the tracer being bound, more of the endogenous ligand occupying and activating receptors, and your signal goes down. So that change from baseline to the activated state gives you an indirect measure of neurotransmitter release. So measuring neurotransmission non-invasively in humans, as opposed to just activation or blood flow, for example. You can have the opposite. You have less of the endogenous transmitter floating around, more tracer being bound to the receptors, and you have a deactivation state. The signal goes up. So it's actually the opposite of what you will see with traditional functional MRI experiments. So what happens when you actually put somebody in pain for 20 minutes at moderate levels, well tolerated, safely done, and so forth? First of all, the main thing was there was tremendous inter-individual variability. If you look at just the baseline state without pain, some people had a lot of baseline binding, some people had very little. If you then apply the challenge, the painful challenge, some people release a lot, like this one, for example, where the signal went down a lot, others as well, others not so much. So there was tremendous inter-individual variation. However, this inter-individual variation was associated with the change in the state of the individual. So we measure this with the traditional measure McGill Pain Questionnaire that has sensory scores that relate to the sensory quality of the pain, affective scores, or the so-called unpleasantness of pain, but we also measure the affective state of the volunteers, in this case using the positive and negative affectivity scale, looking at negative affect, which is just the internal state of the volunteers, has nothing to do with pain. And what we found was that the more the release of these endogenous opioids in some areas of the brain, the more the reduction in sensory elements of the experience. In other areas, more the reduction of the affective quality or unpleasantness of pain, and yet other areas, such as the basal ganglia and the dorsal cingulate cortex, the less the negative affect experienced by the volunteers during this stressful challenge. So it's like real estate, right? Depending on where you are releasing and how much you are releasing, you have a change in particular elements of the pain experience during pain. We also looked at dopamine in response to the pain challenge. There was a lot of dopamine being released in the basal ganglia. In dorsal areas was actually associated in the dorsal caudate and dorsal putamen with sensory qualities of the pain. These are areas of the brain or the basal ganglia that receive connections from the somatosensory cortex. However, in the ventral basal ganglia, this was more non-specific release, dopamine release, and this was actually related more to the negative affective quality of the challenge. Fear scores and negative affective scores were positively correlated with dopamine release in this region, suggesting that at least in the ventral basal ganglia and the nucleus accumbens, which is involved in reward, this was responding to the salience, the negative salience of the stimulus. So what happens with the whole placebo story? Well, this is actually from clinical trials, actually from GSK. They were very nice to give me data for some of their studies. This was a study that was done looking at placebo, a new drug that was testing, drug A, and Paxil, paroxetine, which is a commonly used antidepressant. And on the left, you will see there was no separation between placebo, the new drug in green they were testing, and a traditional antidepressant. So this one was a so-called failed trial, didn't go anywhere. Didn't go to FDA registration. On the right side, it was this new drug at low dose and high dose compared to placebo in dark blue. And this one, actually, they saw an effect of this drug against placebo. And this went on for FDA registration trials. Great. So what made this study being positive and this one negative? If you look at the effect of drugs, it was exactly the same in terms of the improvement in depression scores. This was in major depression, as in the other one, and the difference between them was that the placebo response was lower in the second study. It had nothing to do with the effect of the active drugs. It had to do with the magnitude of the placebo response and how that interfered with finding positive effects on the actual compounds. All right, so why do we see placebo responses in clinical trials? If people have asked these questions, and in a clinical trial, then they've noticed that there may be a spontaneous recovery, natural history. Things change. In pain, you see changes in pain over time. In depression, mood state actually changes. You can see that traditionally in all the studies. So natural history could be an issue. There could be an improvement in function while you are under observation, and this was actually done originally in the 1940s, 1950s, in a steel case furniture factory where they told the workers that they were going to be observed to look at methods for improvement in production. Of course, production improved just by looking at it. It's the so-called Hawthorne Effect. There may be response biases. You may want to please your clinician. You have a bias towards responding positively towards the treatment. And the use of subjective endpoints. Most of the things that we are actually working with, say mood disorders, say pain, for example, internal states, are subjective, and therefore they will have more variability. And in clinical trials, a higher likelihood of receiving an active treatment. So say, for example, you have a two-arm study. You have a 50% chance of getting the active drug. If you have a three-arm study, you have a 66% chance of getting the active drug. You actually will have a greater placebo response if there is a greater expectation of receiving the actual treatment. So this has to do with positive expectancies, a higher frequency of appointments, greater rapport with the clinician. So this speaks of a social interaction, which very much is involved in these processes. And having the same clinician, all have been associated with lesser separation between placebo and active arms in randomized controlled trials by promoting placebo responses. So, more than half of the studies that look at brain function, brain responses in whatever illness you want to, whether it's pain, substance abuse, they don't separate from placebo. So this clearly is a confound in clinical trials, a huge confound. But if you're getting better when I'm not giving you anything, I really want to know why. So that could be a resiliency mechanism. And the idea is, how is this affecting pathophysiology? So I'll give you some examples from the studies that we've been doing. This was actually done, again, with two tracers, one looking at mu-opioid receptors and one looking at dopamine. We basically had a pain challenge. We introduced a placebo, which was simply isotonic saline IV at the site of the subject. We measured expectancies. And we did a couple of different variations of these. But basically, what we saw was that when you introduce a placebo and there is expectation of analgesia, when you do that, there is activation of endogenous opioid neurotransmission, activating mu-opioid receptors in areas such as the periaqueductal gray, a critical area for pain control, orbitofrontal cortex, more decision-making, subgenual anterior cingulate, more associated with mood states, nucleus accumbens associated with reward, but also pain regulation, and the dorsal cingulate, another area involved in pain regulation. And the more the release of these endogenous opioids, the more the improvement in pain ratings, but also the more the improvement in the affective state of the volunteers, depending on the brain area that was being activated. And, And we also looked at dopamine, and yes, we also saw release of dopamine in response to placebo administration, primarily in the ventral basal ganglia, and the more the dopamine release, the more the improvement in pain. And in fact, if you look at dopamine seemed to be accounting for about 1/4 of the variance in response to placebo administration. The more dopamine you release, probably acting as a saliency signal, the more you release endogenous opioids in the nucleus accumbens, the ventral putamen, amygdala, posterior insular cortex, anterior insular cortex, and anterior insular cortex, and anterior cingulate cortex, all of them areas involved in representation of mood and improvement in mood, but also pain as well. So what defines an individual a placebo responder versus a non-responder in these studies? The other thing that we also see is that in about 15 to 20% of the individuals that participate in these studies, they actually don't have a placebo response when you administer the placebo. They actually have the opposite, the nocebo. In fact, you can look at that in any booklet looking at medication side effects, and you will see the column of the placebo administration, the active drug administration, and you will see that in the column of placebo administration, there are about 15% of cases who actually have side effects from placebo administration. That's called a nocebo response. It's the opposite. So what happens in these individuals is the majority had a placebo response in green, so the pain went down from their baseline after placebo administration, but in about 15-20% in these studies, actually the pain went up, so they had a nocebo response. And so what differentiates these individuals? If you look at responders, those who had a pain reduction with placebo administration of more than 10%, that was kind of our criterion, there were individuals that were releasing more endogenous opioids and more dopamine exclusively in the ventral basal ganglia, specifically the nucleus accumbens, which is involved in reward mechanisms, but also pain control mechanisms. And the same happened with placebo responses and nocebo responders, who also release more endogenous opioids in the case of responders versus nocebo in the same areas. And in fact, what was going on is that you had a balance of release of these dopamine and endogenous opioids depending on whether you had a placebo response, analgesic response, or a nocebo, hyperalgesic response, where the placebo responders release more in green of these endogenous opioids across these brain regions, as well as dopamine, while the nocebo responders had less release, they had a deactivation. So you have a certain tone, and depending on how your brain is interpreting the situation that you're actually undergoing, you will release more doing a placebo response or release less, having a nocebo hyperalgesic response to the intervention. So if there is a biology to it, there has to be some genetic regulation of this variability. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. We've looked at a bunch of them. One of them was a common polymorphism for the mu-opioid receptor. Obviously, the place to look, because we know the mu-opioid receptor is involved. So this is the A118G variation is present in the G variant. It's thought to have less function, and it's been associated with things like substance abuse, for example, more chronic pain, and so forth, and less effect of some medications. And the G allele, which is present in about 15 to 20% of individuals, was associated with much less mu-opioid receptor availability or binding pretty much throughout the brain. So there was less capacity of these receptors pretty much throughout. And also the individuals that were G allele carriers released less endogenous opioids and less dopamine in the ventral basal ganglia. The result of this was that they actually had less capacity to respond to the placebo administration. There was less release in the G carriers for both less release of endogenous opioids and dopamine, and they also had more depression as well as more trait vulnerability scores for these individuals. So that's one genetic variation that was impacting on these mechanisms. Another one that we looked at that was actually rather unexpected, and I want to tell you about that because it's taking us in a slightly different direction research-wise, is one related to FAAH. FAAH is fatty acid amide hydrolase, and is the main enzyme that metabolizes the endocannabinoids. So this is the cannabinoid system. You know, marijuana, THC, well, you have an endocannabinoid system that has metabolic function, has a number of functions, regulatory functions, and it's metabolized primarily by this enzyme. There is a missense polymorphism in this variant that actually is in about 45%, is present in about 45% of individuals. And what we saw was that the individuals that had this lesser functioning variant had less release in black of these endogenous opioids in response to placebo administration. But not on dopamine, didn't do anything on dopamine, which for us was surprising because there is a long literature of endocannabinoids modulating dopamine transmission. In the context of these positive expectations associated with placebo administration, there was no effect on dopamine, there was a selective effect on endogenous opioid transmission, and it was associated with greater placebo analgesia and both placebo-induced positive affective states. So the individuals that were more able to metabolize the endocannabinoids more appropriately had a greater placebo analgesia and positive affective state during pain, but it did not affect, which was very interesting, baseline pain psychophysics. So pain tolerance, thresholds, and so forth were actually not affected by the polymorphism. It was only in the context of the treatment, in the treatment context and placebo that this was actually happening. So then the next question we ask, are these mechanisms generalizable? So we looked at the major depression. This was an initial study. We have a second one going now in a different fashion. It's somewhat complicated, but the basic idea on this one is that you have patients with major depression, unmedicated, and you randomize them into two groups. One of them receives a placebo, and you tell them it's a placebo. Therefore, there is no expectation that this will be helpful. In the other one, you are telling them that it will be something that may actually improve their mood state, which actually is true. So there is no, but it was the same placebo. So and then you randomize them back, so the same people then crossed over to the other arm of the study. And then, so we treated them for 1 week, and then in the scanner, we gave them IV isotonic saline, IV placebo, to look at the response of these systems in response to the activation, the placebo-induced activation of endogenous opioids and dopamine transmission. And then after we finished all this, we did the washout, and then we started open-label antidepressant treatment for 10 weeks. So the idea was to look at, well, these things, the systems are activated in pain, they seem to be mediating placebo analgesia, do they mediate placebo antidepressant effects? And to make a fairly long story short, the answer is yes. So first of all, when we introduced the placebo, so basically we compare the activity of the system when the placebo was inactive versus when the placebo was active. And it was, those were introduced for a week each. And there was evidence of release of endogenous opioids in response to placebo administration when it was thought to be active compared to inactive. And this was correlated positively with improvement in mood that was experienced with the placebo administration. Make sense? And then we also looked at how this contributed to antidepressant response. So we saw release of, and by the way, the areas where we're seeing this release of endogenous opioids are the subgenual anterior cingulate, the nucleus accumbens, the amygdala, medial thalamus, all of them areas centrally implicated in the pathophysiology of major depression and stress regulation. So these systems are dysregulated in major depression. So when we then compare the release of these endogenous opioids in response to placebo administration with antidepressant response after 10 weeks, there was a heavy positive relationship between the capacity to activate these internal resiliency stress reduction mechanisms, the endogenous opioid system and opioid receptors, and the capacity to respond to antidepressants, accounting for 43% of the variance, which is humongous. So 43% of the variance in response to placebo of responses to placebo to antidepressant were accounted for by the capacity to activate these endogenous systems in response to, in this case, an inactive drug, placebo, again in the same areas, subgenual anterior cingulate, accumbens, insular cortex, amygdala hippocampal region, and medial thalamus, again, all areas involving motion regulation, stress reduction. And in fact, when you look at the data, overall remission rates for these patients were actually higher in the placebo responder group versus the non-responders. So if you look at actually the data over the 10 weeks of active antidepressant administration, by the second week there was a separation with those individuals that were initially placebo responders actually responding overall better to antidepressant administration, while it was not the case for the placebo non-responders. And placebo responders, in fact, showed much greater improvement in depression scores, symptom scores, over the 10-week antidepressant trial. So that's all I want to tell you. So introducing a little bit of these themes of placebo, internal resiliency mechanisms, and the idea that we can probably attempt to harness them, and so forth. So basically what I told you was that both opioid and dopamine systems appear involved in the formation of placebo and treatment responses, potentially across pathologies. We looked at this in pain. Other people have looked at Parkinson's disease for dopamine, and now in the last study in major depression. We see that, at least in the ventral striatum, in the nucleus accumbens, dopamine seems to respond to the saliency of the stimulus, while a distributed system of endogenous opioid and opioid receptors appear to be the effectors of placebo analgesic and antidepressant effects in humans. We are also tracing some of this interindividual variation in placebo responders to common genetic polymorphisms. We've also looked at trait measures. I didn't get into that because I didn't want to go too long in the talk. And this actually is relevant, not only for clinical trials, because it's a confound, but also for the understanding of mechanisms related to vulnerability and resiliency to disease, including treatment responses. So where do we go from here with all this work? So we are going to be looking at these mechanisms in the context of opioid dependence and misuse. That's ongoing. We are also asking questions such as, does the integrity of these systems, these stress regulatory systems, influence response to antidepressant treatments? We saw how a polymorphism in the main enzyme that metabolizes the endocannabinoids affects these. So we're actually looking at CB1 receptors, which are the main mediators of endocannabinoid action in the human brain, are mediating some of these effects. So we're looking at that now. We are also asking the question, what is the interaction between placebo-responsive mechanisms and antidepressant effects? So you have an antidepressant, you have a placebo mechanism. Are they interacting with each other? Do the antidepressants enhance placebo responses? Is it the opposite? So we are looking at whether this is an additive effect or is interactive. And there is some suggestion that it may be interactive, at least in some cases. So one would enhance the other. Would placebo responses maybe would imply a greater response to non-interventional approaches. So when you talk about placebos, you are talking about an interaction, an interchange between the patient and the treating clinician, literally. So it's a social interaction, it's a social element that is very important for these processes. Does this mean that psychotherapies are more indicated in individuals who have more intact internal resiliency mechanisms as measured by these processes? And another thing we are looking at is biomarkers. So would biomarkers link, for example, to the response of the endogenous opioid system in response to placebo administration or otherwise would allow stratification in clinical trials? And so far looks like inflammatory, endocrine, and genetic factors actually seem to be affecting these mechanisms. So those are some of the areas we're looking at. Of course, acknowledge our team, which is now here at the University of Utah. This is from Michigan, actually. And thank you very much for your attention. Oops, sorry. Thank you.
It's my honor to talk to you about my work, my research on an intervention that I developed called mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement. And this is a therapy that I developed by translating findings from basic behavioral science and neuroscience into a treatment for addiction, stress, and pain. So I want to begin with a story from my clinical practice because I think this will kind of pull everything together for you. So recently I was approached by a gentleman who was seeking help to deal with chronic pain and opioid-related issues. He had had a series of 5 failed back surgeries, and after each surgery he had received escalating doses of opioids. He knew he was taking too high of a dose. He knew he had a problem with opioids, but as he so poignantly stated to me, I just don't want to be in pain. So to understand how to help people like this, we need to understand the role that hedonic dysregulation plays in pain, pleasure, and addiction. In historical Western philosophy, pleasure and pain have been considered opposites on a hedonic balance, such that experiences of pain are thought to outweigh the experience of pleasure in everyday life. The duality and unity of pleasure and pain have been classical targets for contemplative practices and philosophies. Take this quote by Tibetan meditation master Virupa. But modern neurobiological science suggests that pleasure and pain actually are not opposites, but instead operate through a common emotional currency in the brain, mediated by the mesocorticolimbic dopamine system and the endogenous opioid system. And these neural circuits, which are involved in processing hedonic or pleasurable experience, are the same neural circuits that become hijacked by addictive drugs through an allostatic process in which increasing sensitization to drug-related reward comes to outweigh the experience of pleasure from natural rewards, from healthy objects and experiences in the social environment. So to understand the role that hedonic dysregulation plays in the downward spiral linking chronic pain to prescription opioid misuse, my colleagues and I developed the following theoretical model. So I'm just going to run you through it very briefly. So in brief, the recurrent experience of pain leads to attentional fixation or rumination on pain, which can result in negative emotions and stress. Then when patients take opioids, the opioids not only temporarily alleviate the pain, but they also alleviate the stress and negative emotions, at least temporarily. And then through the process of negative reinforcement conditioning, strengthen the opioid use habit, resulting in an opioid attentional bias or a hyperfixation of attention on opioid-related cues, like the sight of a pill bottle or when you're driving by a pharmacy, finding your attention involuntarily captured by those cues, which can drive opioid craving irrespective of the need to obtain pain relief. When this cycle recurs over and over again, it may result in neuroplastic changes to the brain, which can lead to hyperalgesia or an increased sensitivity to pain among some patients, as well as an insensitivity to natural reward, as we discussed earlier, resulting in opioid dose escalation as a means of obtaining hedonic equilibrium, and ultimately leading to the loss of control over opioid use that's characteristic of opioid addiction. So in my lab at C-MIIND, we measure hedonic dysregulation with a number of tasks from cognitive neuroscience. I'm going to tell you about one right now. The first one is called the dot probe test. And you ate your lunch, but it's been about an hour, so I'm not so worried about this next slide. So in the dot probe test, we have a computer screen and it's split in two. On one side of the screen is a pain-related image. On the other is a neutral image. These images are presented for a very brief amount of time, either 200 milliseconds or 2,000 milliseconds, after which they disappear and are replaced by a dot. The participant's task is to choose the side with the dot. If the dot shows up on the left-hand side of the screen, they hit the left arrow. If it shows up on the right-hand side of the screen, they hit the right arrow. The computer records reaction times. And it turns out there's a large body of research to show that chronic pain patients are faster to find the dot when it replaces the pain photograph than when it replaces the neutral photograph. And this provides an objective index of how much their attention is being captured by pain-related information. We also pair neutral images and naturally rewarding, pleasant images. And we pair opioid images and neutral images. And my lab was the first to demonstrate the presence of a prescription opioid attentional bias among chronic pain patients who misused opioids. And amazingly, we found that this prescription opioid attentional bias predicted whether patients were going to misuse opioids up to 20 weeks following the end of therapy, suggesting that opioid misusers exhibit sensitivity to drug-related cues. In my lab at C-MIIND with my good staff here, who I would like to recognize at the end of this talk, we also measure hedonic dysregulation with the emotion regulation task. In this task, participants are presented with emotional images, negative emotional images and positive emotional images. In response to the negative emotional images, they're asked to either simply pay attention to the image or to reappraise the meaning of that image, to reframe what's happening in the image as an opportunity perhaps for personal growth or a learning opportunity. So for example, with this mother and child crying, a reappraisal might be, the mother and child faced the tragedy together, but in doing so, it brought them closer as a family. Doing this can downregulate negative emotions. In contrast, when we present positive images, we ask patients to pay attention to them or to savor them, to mindfully focus attention on the image and notice positive emotions arising in response to the image and appreciate them, as well as any higher order affective meaning arising in response to the savoring experience. And during this task, we measure heart rate variability, which, if you're not familiar, is the beat-to-beat variation in heart rate controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system that's thought to be governed by a higher order brain network involving brain regions that help regulate attention and emotion. So recently, my colleagues and I published findings indicating that opioid misusing chronic pain patients showed significantly blunted heart rate variability during reappraisal of negative images, viewing positive images, and savoring positive images relative to chronic pain patients who took their opioids as prescribed by their doctor. We also found that opioid dose was significantly negatively correlated with positive emotion regulation efficacy. In other words, the patients who took the highest doses of opioids were the least able to increase their positive emotional response in response to the positive images, which is pretty sad, actually. And it suggests that opioid misusers exhibit insensitivity to natural reward and deficiencies in emotion regulation. So if this is the problem in this condition, what's the solution? So I developed mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement as a means of tackling addiction, stress, and pain. And mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, or MORE, is an integrative therapy that unites complementary aspects of mindfulness training, third-wave cognitive behavioral therapy, and principles from positive psychology. MORE is a sequence treatment. It begins with a foundation of mindfulness training, including mindful breathing and body scan meditations, which from a cognitive neuroscience perspective are intended to strengthen capacities like attentional control and metacognitive awareness, which can then be applied to more complex therapeutic processes like reappraisal and savoring. So we build a foundation of mental stability and clarity through mindfulness. Then we apply the mental stability and clarity to helping people reframe the meaning of the stressors in their life and to savor natural pleasure. These therapeutic components are intended to modulate a series of therapeutic mechanisms and in turn produce stepwise change in a series of clinically relevant intervention targets. And today I'm going to be focusing on two such mechanisms: shifting from affective to sensory processing of pain and craving sensations, and restructuring of reward processing. So in MORE, patients are taught mindfulness as a means of shifting from affective to sensory processing of pain sensations. Chronic pain patients typically experience pain as a monolithic, solid, and unchanging entity, over which they lay a layer of suffering. They say to themselves, "Why me? This isn't fair. This pain is ruining my life." And that makes the pain worse. In MORE, patients are taught mindfulness to remove this emotional overlay and to decompose the pain experience into its subcomponent features. So rather than pay attention to pain as some terrible, awful, emotionally anguishing thing, we teach them to focus in on the sensations themselves. So perhaps pain is really a cluster of sensations of heat or tingling or tightness. We also teach patients to focus on the spaces in between the sensations where there's either no sensation at all or potentially positive sensations. And in doing so, this may make it easier to cope with the monolithic experience of pain as a whole. We call this zooming in. Similarly, in Moore, patients are taught the same mindfulness technique to cope with craving, breaking it down into its cognitive, emotional, and physiological sensations. Let's talk a moment about how Moore teaches patients to savor natural pleasure as a means of restructuring the hedonic dysregulation deficits that I talked about earlier. So in session 4 of the intervention, patients are asked to focus mindful attention on a bouquet of flowers, carefully paying attention to the pleasant colors, shapes, textures, and scents of the flowers, as well as the touch of the petals against their skin. Patients are guided to not only to focus on the positive sensory aspects of the experience, but to notice how the mind and body respond to the experience. And when positive emotions are noted, the patient cultivates a metacognitive form of awareness to then focus on and appreciate and absorb the positive emotions themselves. And this technique is intended to restructure reward, shifting valuation from drug-related reward to valuation of natural rewards as a means of reducing addictive behavior. And I call this the restructuring reward hypothesis. So if you're interested, I encourage you to read my theoretical paper in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. So recently, I guess a couple years ago now, it's not so recent, we completed a clinical trial of Moore as a treatment for chronic pain patients who were taking long-term prescription opioids. This was an NIH-funded stage 1 trial. We randomly assigned 115 chronic pain patients to receive either 8 weeks of Moore or 8 weeks of a process group. And nearly 3/4 of the sample reported misusing opioids. And not surprisingly, there were high rates of comorbidity in the sample, a lot of depression, anxiety, PTSD. In summary of the findings, we found that Moore led to significantly greater reductions in pain-related interference than the control group. And this effect was strengthened and maintained at 3 months follow-up. So pain interference measures how much pain is interfering with a person's general activity level, mood, walking ability, normal work, relationships with others, sleep, and enjoyment of life. We also found that Moore led to statistically significant yet modest reductions in pain intensity itself that were strengthened and maintained by the follow-up. With regard to the opioid-related outcomes, we found that Moore reduced opioid craving, even after we controlled for changes in pain severity. And we found that Moore reduced opioid misuse. There was a 68% reduction in opioid misuse in the Moore group compared to a 32% reduction in the control group, suggesting that this treatment really has therapeutic potential. To understand the mechanisms of the therapy, again, remember when I started this whole symposium, I'm not only interested in whether treatments work, but also how do they work. And the question how is important because it helps us understand how to make therapies better, how to optimize them. So to measure mechanisms, we use the dot probe task. And we found that Moore significantly decreased the pain attentional bias compared to the control group. People became less hyperfixated on pain-related information. We also found that among patients with an opioid attentional bias, Moore significantly reduced the opioid attentional bias. But we found some fascinating data in heart rate data collected during this task. So I don't think you need to know a lot about statistics to see that there's something big going on here. Essentially, what we found was that across all 3 Q conditions of the dot probe task, Moore was associated with significantly greater reductions in heart rate compared to the control group. But there was no difference in resting baseline heart rate, suggesting that these effects are not mere relaxation effects, but rather are specific to attention to emotional information. Moore seems to change the way people pay attention to emotional information. So to understand the clinical relevance of this, we asked patients to rate how aroused they felt by the photographs. And not surprisingly, decreases in heart rate in response to the opioid and the pain photographs was correlated with decreased arousal reports. They felt less triggered by those images. We found the opposite pattern in response to the pleasure photographs. Decreases in heart rate in response to the pleasure photographs were correlated with increased arousal reports, suggesting that Moore might increase physiological sensitivity to natural reward. We conducted a heart rate variability analysis and found that across the board, Moore was associated in significantly greater increases in heart rate variability than the control group, but that this effect was most pronounced to the pleasure cue condition in post hoc testing. So who cares? what's the clinical relevance of this? And Susan was pushing us, what's the relevance of this work? Do rigorous science, but why does it matter to society? Well, here's why. We conducted a multivariate path analysis and found that the effects of more on reducing opioid craving were statistically mediated by changing heart rate response to pleasure cues, not by changing heart rate response to the opioid cues. In other words, more appears to reduce opioid craving by increasing physiological responsivity to natural pleasure, natural reward. And quite frankly, this was the most important finding of my entire career. I may not ever find anything bigger than this, to tell you the truth. Because it really suggests that the reversal of the allostatic process of addiction that leads to hedonic dysregulation is possible through mental training. And we found converging evidence in EEG data collected during the task. We found that more was associated in significantly greater increases in the late positive potential of the EEG in response to natural reward stimuli. And this increase in brain responsivity to natural reward was again correlated with reduced opioid craving, suggesting that more might reduce craving by enhancing physiological sensitivity to natural pleasure. And we also found converging evidence in ecological momentary assessments. So we asked people up to 4 times a day to report on their mood state and their pain level across the 8 weeks of the therapy. So this gives you a lot of data, 224 data points to be precise. And we found that across the treatment, more was associated in significantly greater reductions in pain from moment to moment. But it was also associated with significantly greater increases in positive emotions from moment to moment compared to the control group. In fact, the participants in more were 2.75 times more likely to be positively, affectively regulated, to be able to keep their mood in a positive state than people in the control group. Interestingly, decreases in pain were not associated with decreases in opioid misuse, but increases in positive emotions were. The patients who showed the largest increase in the trajectory of positive emotions showed the greatest reductions in opioid misuse. Again, suggesting that more may, in fact, restructure reward processing, increasing sensitivity to natural reward, which can come to outweigh drug reward, and thereby reduce addictive behavior. And we're finding converging evidence for this in fMRI pilot studies with smokers and psychophysiological research with obese people, looking at their responses to food cues. The same pattern. The more we teach people how to savor natural pleasure, to get joy from everyday experience, the less they're seeking it from unhealthy substances outside of themselves. So C-MIIND is interested in studying mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement, but we also want to do really pragmatic work that can be easily implemented and disseminated throughout society. So I'm just going to really quickly tell you about an example of a study that I did with my colleague Yoshi Nakamura. So last year we conducted a study at the University of Utah Hospital with patients who were in intolerable, unmanageable pain. These are folks, writhing around in their hospital beds in pain from a variety of diseases, injuries, and surgeries. And what happened was when patients would report this pain level, they would get a flag in their medical chart. It would flag the social worker to approach the patient, and the social worker would ask the patient if they wanted to participate in a brief social work intervention. And if they said yes, they were randomly assigned to receive either 15 minutes of a scripted mindfulness intervention, 15 minutes of a hypnotic suggestion intervention that was also scripted, or 15 minutes of an education control condition. And we measured pain and related outcomes immediately before and immediately after the intervention. And what we found was pretty darn remarkable. 15 minutes of a brief scripted mindfulness intervention reduced acute pain intensity by 23%. Brief scripted hypnotic suggestion reduced pain by 29%. And pain coping education itself reduced pain by 9%. Across the people who received one of the 2 mind-body interventions, nearly a third of them achieved at least a 30% reduction in pain intensity, which is considered clinically significant. And it's also comparable to the amount of pain relief you would receive from taking 5 milligrams of oxycodone. Which makes me wonder, why aren't we doing this in every hospital and healthcare center in the country? 15 minutes. The people who do, I want to underscore, these were not Mbsr instructors. This was an average hospital social worker who received 2 hours of training in how to deliver these interventions. could alleviate the pain and suffering of people with really serious medical conditions. So it suggests to me that mind-body therapies may be cost-effective and feasible to implement in standard healthcare. So in conclusion, and I really thank you for your attention and sticking with me here, mind-body therapies like MORE are promising treatments for addiction, stress, and pain. MORE may ameliorate chronic opioid use and misuse by strengthening the hedonic regulation of pain, craving, and reward. And from a clinical standpoint, teaching patients to take in the good and mindfully savor natural, healthy pleasure may provide the learning signal needed to reverse addiction, which I know is a bold statement, but now we're engaged in a lot of pretty exciting studies to test this hypothesis further. And ultimately, techniques like MORE and other forms of mind-body therapies may reverse the downward spiral linking chronic pain to opioid misuse and stimulate an upward spiral of mindfulness to meaning. So thank you for your attention. We're holding the next clinical training in mindfulness-oriented recovery enhancement on September 16th and 17th. I really want to acknowledge my C-MIIND team, so could you guys please stand? My C-MIIND scientists and assistants, coordinators, thank you for all that you do. And thanks to all of you for your attention.